Welcome everybody. Can you hear me okay? Yep, okay. So this is a session on climate change, journalism and advocacy. We've got a great panel, but before they introduce themselves, I'm just going to give you a bit of context about what's prompted this discussion. My name is James Painter. I'm a research associate at the Reuters Institute for the Study of Journalism at Oxford University, but I was also a journalist at the BBC for a long time as well. Why we thought this was particularly apposite and appropriate right now is that for those of you who follow this issue, you will know that in October last year, the IPCC issued a report on 1.5 degrees and what society had to do to reach the goal of keeping global temperature increases below or at 1.5. And I was lucky enough to have a sort of peripheral role in the communication of that report. And one of the key phrases that they used was that society needed to have unprecedented changes to be able to reach that 1.5 target. And that prompted quite a lot of discussion within the journalist community about what the proper role, the appropriate role of journalists should be, given the urgency of societal change. And some prominent spokespeople or commentators on the media said, what we need is yet more coverage. We need more and more coverage so that it enters people's consciousness. Other people argue, no, we don't want more coverage. We want a particular type of coverage. We want new ways of engaging young people. We want new ways of reporting solutions, not doom and gloom. And other people commented and said, we really need the greatest minds in media to really think through how to report this desperately urgent issue to enable us to go down the path of societal transformations. So the great minds are here, assembled, three of them. We're very lucky. So just by way of, I'm going to come back to them in a minute, but I just wanted them to introduce themselves first, very briefly, so you get a sense of the great minds on the panel. So Emma, you first.
Hi, I'm Emma Howard. Thank you. I'm Emma Howard. I totally reject that label, but it's very flattering. So I now work for Unearthed, which is an investigative news site that is based at and was launched by Greenpeace. And before that, I spent close to 3 years at The Guardian. I did a year on their trainee scheme, and then I was asked to work on the Keep It in the Ground campaign and on the environment desk for a year. And before that, I'd sort of had a mix of experience in journalism and campaigning.
Okay, that's enough. Ingrid?
Hi, I'm Ingerid. I'm a journalist from Norway. Been covering climate change for a couple of years. Became a bit frustrated from doing that, and so I had the privilege to go to the Reuters Institute in Oxford, where I was a journalist fellow, and did a study on how to make journalism on climate change more engaging, and then studying the Keep It in the Ground campaign that Emma was a part of.
Great.
Hi, so I'm Richard Black. I covered science and environment for the BBC for about 15 years, mainly for BBC World Service and for the website. I left about 7 years ago, and I now run a small think tank in London called the Energy and Climate Intelligence Unit, and we still work a lot with journalists in journalism. And last year, shameless plug, I wrote the first and only book about the UK's climate skeptic movement, about which I'll be very happy to talk to anyone about later on.
Okay, thank you very much for that plug, Richard. I think just to get a sense of where you guys are at, how many of you are familiar with the Guardian's Keep It in the Ground campaign? If you could just put your hand up. How many are not familiar with it? Okay, so just by way of introduction, the reason why we chose to talk briefly about this about this campaign, was that it was virtually unprecedented for a well-known international media organization to actually take a campaigning stance on climate change. There's lots of examples, which I'm sure will come up in the discussion, of other media organizations campaigning, but there have been very few, as far as I know, of a big, important media organization deciding to campaign. And by campaigning, I mean it in a narrow sense. It linked up with a very well-known NGO called 350.org to have very specific targets about asking two well-known charitable foundations, the Gates Foundation and Wellcome Trust, to divest their holdings in oil and gas companies. As we will hear, they wanted to do other things as well, but that was one of the key aims. So back in March 2015, they launched the campaign with a series of sort of very dramatic front pages of The Guardian of oil dripping down in one case. And in the course of the next 2 or 3 months, they did a huge amount of coverage on climate change, and they were aiming to get a lot of engagement from their audience. And they covered the whole divestment campaign as well, with a great deal of emphasis. And so it raises a whole series of very interesting questions, which we're now going to explore. Was this campaign successful? How do you judge a campaign? Did it have costs for journalism? And then on the basis of that discussion, we're then going to broaden it out to address wider issues of journalism and advocacy. And I should stress right at the beginning that many people mean very different things by advocacy. But I'm going to use it mostly in this narrower sense of when a journalistic organization decides to link up with an NGO with very specific policy orientation and goals, and see what the pros and cons of that is. So that's the setting, but I'd just like to get a sense from you guys about whether in general you think journalists should do more advocacy in a very broad sense of trying to get society to address this issue of how we're going to bring about the societal changes that are needed to tackle climate change, whether you think that it's perfectly legitimate for an organization like The Guardian to do a campaign, an advocacy campaign in the narrow sense, or whether you just want to listen to the panel and make your own mind up. So you've got 3 options to show your hands, okay? So the first one is, do you think that such is the gravity of the climate challenge that you think journalists should really grapple now with how to provide information in interesting ways that in general terms should promote societal change? Put your hand up if you agree with that. Oh, so a lot of you. Okay, great. How many of you are in agreement with this narrower statement that you think that what The Guardian did was a good idea? That in a narrow sense of advocacy, you think that's great? Not so many. And how many of you are very wise and you want to hear the pros and cons of the argument? Oh, you're not very humble, are you? You think you already know the answers. Okay, then we'll do another test at the end to see whether you've changed your mind as a result of this discussion. Okay, without any more ado, Emma, as she said, was involved in the campaign. So she's going to talk briefly about her experience of that campaign and some of the issues that it raises. Emma, over to you.
Hi. So the campaign was more than 4 years ago now, so I had to jog my memory a bit. But it started with an email on Christmas Eve from Alan Rusbridger, who was then the editor of The Guardian. And he was looking forward to 6 months ahead when he was going to be resigning from The Guardian after 20 years at its head. And he kind of looked back on that and felt that there was one thing that he hadn't really grappled with fully, and that was the issue of climate change. And so he emailed sort of 30, 40 journalists at the paper and said, I want the last 6 months of my editorship at the paper to focus on this issue. And I want us to do something big and different and to challenge our assumptions. And I don't know what that is yet, but when we get back in the new year, we'll discuss. So that's what happened, and the next 2 months were spent debating what we should do, and then the rest of the year was spent on the campaign. I think the overarching goal that we started with was that we wanted to put climate change on the front page, and we wanted to do it differently. So we wanted to challenge all of our assumptions about how you do journalism on climate change, and use all the formats at our disposal, all of the newsroom at our disposal that you wouldn't normally see reporting on climate change, and to shift the debate So for a long time, the debate on climate change had been basically about the science, and it was felt that that was, more or less settled now, and that we wanted to shift it to be about the economics of it, to be about what it looks like for society, to the politics of it, because all the time that you spend sort of debating the science, you're not spending time debating what we should do about it, and what it means for society. And we wanted to do that in the year in the run-up to the Paris deal in order to build momentum, to put pressure on corporations and governments to do something about this and contribute to that kind of ecosystem of building momentum for the deal. So there was really kind of two parts to the campaign. One was editorial. So that was, as I said, to find lots of new ways of talking about it. So we did loads of things, everything from kind of commissioning leading poets to launching something called the Climate Publishers Network, which was an agreement with media organizations across the world, from Le Monde to China Daily, that we would share content with each other so that we could freely publish their stuff on climate change and vice versa, as a way of building momentum. Right down to sort of numerous investigations into kind of organizations that you know and those that you know less of, to a podcast that we did where we basically recorded all of our meetings, and then that was made into a podcast. So it was kind of looking at us grappling with how do you deal with this issue, and because we wanted to be kind of as transparent as possible about it, particularly because it was a campaign. So that was kind of the first part of it was editorial, and then the second part of it, which is a more controversial part, was explicitly to do a campaign where you go out and you ask for a specific policy change in society. And what we ended up deciding on was to ask the two biggest charitable foundations in the world. So that's the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, which does development work, and the Wellcome Trust, which is the biggest fund for kind of medical and health, for health donations in the world. And we asked them to move their investments in fossil fuels to get rid of them, which was comprised an awful lot of money. And I think within that, our kind of aim was, there was already an existing divestment movement, so we can't claim to have started divestment. And that had been going since 2012, and we were really inspired by that when we were debating what should the campaign be. There was a lot of inspiration by that, and it put we chose it, I think, because it put the emphasis on the economics of it, and it shifted the debate away from the science and onto the economics of it. And there was this whole kind of ecosystem going on behind us of people already working on this, so that we could kind of put rocket boosters up that movement. And it was a movement that wouldn't sort of die when the news organisation stopped campaigning on this, that it could have some kind of longevity outside of The Guardian. Do you want me to talk about sort of challenges, or should we
very quickly, just if you could say if you could just say, capture some of the debates within the Guardian editorial side about how they felt about campaigning on an issue.
Yeah. So there was a lot of debate in the newsroom, as you might think. Some people very much felt that we should never go near a campaign. Other people said, well, it's actually not that unusual for news organisations to campaign. The Daily Mail probably runs a campaign once a week on its front page. And other people felt, well, the British print press may be different in the US, definitely, but the British print press has always been partisan, and actually, they kind of frequently run kind of campaigns, but they don't really label them as campaigns. So, if you look at Brexit, as Richard mentioned earlier, like you could say that a lot of kind of the coverage of that has been kind of campaigny. It's clearly taken a clear angle, and it's the case with many issues, but they wouldn't label it as a campaign. So I think in the end, we kind of came to the conclusion that if we were as transparent as possible about what we were doing, and we said, look, this is the editorial side, and this is where we're campaigning, and we kind of recorded all our meetings, that it was a legitimate thing to do.
Okay, great. We'll come back to you. There's so many interesting questions. We'll go to Ingerid, and as Ingerid had said, she's written a really great report, which I can recommend, a study at the Reuters Institute, and she's going to summarize some of her findings.
Thanks. So just quickly as a backdrop, I came to the Reuters Institute because I wanted to find out how you can make journalism on climate change that engages the public. And what is the role of journalists, if any, in addressing this issue of climate change and even helping to solve it, if we do have a role in that? And the first thing you learn when you come into a research institution is that you have to narrow down your questions. So then I ended up looking specifically at the Keep It in the Ground campaign, but it is a really good lens to kind of look at these big questions. So I looked at whether or not the campaign succeeded in what it intended to do. And I interviewed a lot of journalists that were central in the campaign to try and find out this. I also did a content analysis of the coverage that The Guardian did during that campaign, and then I compared it to the coverage on climate change and divestment in the New York Times, which is kind of a paper of the similar profile and reach, to see kind of the difference, what it did to the coverage, to try and find out, like, one of the core criticisms to advocacy journalism is often that it reduces the kind of the scope of ideas and perspectives on a case or a story. So I did this content analysis to try and figure out of that, and then I also tried to look at to what extent this campaign kind of broke this journalistic norm that, at least in many Western countries, of objectivity, and whether or not that really matters. I won't go into all the details of the findings right here now, because it will take me too long. But we can talk about it more in the discussion afterwards if you want to. But just quickly, whether or not it succeeded, it's a bit like Emma was saying. It depends on how you look at it. I mean, the goal of getting these two foundations to divest from fossil fuels, they did not do that. But there was a bigger goal of The Guardian of trying to get the readers more engaged in the topic of climate change. And this, I think the campaign did succeed somewhat in. When it comes to whether or not it led to kind of a more how do you say this in English? Monotonous? Monotonous, thank you. Coverage of climate change or divestment. One-sided, a better word. Then, I mean, The Guardian, what it did lead to was that The Guardian wrote a lot more about climate change and from different perspectives. Their coverage on divestment was more political and also more positive than it was in the New York Times, so of course it skewed their coverage on divestment. But then again, as Emma was saying, you could also see this as a result of the UK being a much more partisan political newspaper landscape than in the US, for example. And the third question on the norm of objectivity, like whether or not that was breached and what the consequences of that were, you could see that The Guardian, like some of the bigger oil companies, or at least ExxonMobil, they didn't want to talk to The Guardian during the campaign because they were saying, you're an activist organization, we don't want to talk to you. On the other hand, an oil company like Shell took the opposite approach and said, we want to talk more to you because you clearly prioritize this issue. So there's like kind of different consequences of when you, as a media house, how do you say, go more into the activistic route. But again, this must also be understood in light of the media system and culture that The Guardian is rooted in. As Emma was saying, it's not that unusual for a newspaper in the UK to take such a stance. And what The Guardian did was also being very transparent about it and letting their readers in on their discussions in the newsroom. So you had this podcast rolling at the same time where you could, as a reader, listen to all the discussions in the newsroom from, like you were saying, some journalists were opposed, some journalists were pro, and you, as a reader, you got I mean, the sense of that this is also a difficult question for journalism, but they were being transparent about it, which I think is the most important thing. And then, I mean, what I kind of drew out from this study is that as journalists, there is a question of whether or not we should, I mean, should we do more than just describe the problem of climate change, right? Should we also engage in the solutions, like Emma was mentioning? And as journalists, we can do this in several ways. And the route that The Guardian did, I think that is a cool way of doing it in the UK, where the media culture allows for that in a bigger sense than, for example, in Norway, where I'm from. But I also think that we in Norway could do more of this kind of advocacy thing on climate change, just maybe not as specific as the Keep It in the Ground campaign was, if that makes sense.
Okay, thanks very much. But just to be clear on the divestment issue, The Guardian set out, as part of its objectives, to try and persuade, through a campaign, the Wellcome Trust and the Gates Foundation to divest their considerable holdings in fossil fuel. If I'm not wrong, what did happen was that after the campaign, at least one of them did divest. And we can't tell what the causation was, but I've heard the argument made that The Guardian helped to turbocharge, I think the word is what they used, the whole divestment movement. And even though within a 6-month period it was virtually impossible that any big foundation was going to move, finance decisions take a long time, there was a case that could be made that The Guardian raised the issue, even though it wasn't successful in the course of that period. Is that right, Emma? Is that your understanding?
So I would say there's a kind of a few things that happened during the course of the campaign. One was the Wellcome Trust announced it would put 75 million into a new fund for looking at the links between health and the environment. And Gates Foundation also put 1.3 billion into renewable energy technologies, which was a doubling of what they'd ever done before. And they announced that on the front page of the FT during the campaign. So I feel like we could take some credit for having created the environment for that, for them to feel like they would want to put that on the front page of a newspaper. And then 6 months after the campaign ended, they divested all their holdings in BP, which was 187 million. And there's no way of knowing if we had anything to do with that.
Okay, great. All right, so let's go. Richard, we'll have a slightly different view.
Thanks very much. Yeah, so obviously I wasn't involved with this campaign in any way. I mean, I worked for many years for an institution, the BBC, which is legally and as a matter of culture pursuing objectivity and independence. But I think it's a myth to assume that any journalist can actually be completely objective and independent. In an ideal world, I think journalism would be objective and independent. But I think effectively all organisations do sort of campaign in probably 3 different ways. One is this overt sort of campaign, like Keep It in the Ground, or for example, the Daily Mail recently had a campaign against the use of plastic, for example, and that's overt, it's official, it's out there. I think there's a degree of innate, what you might call innate campaigning that goes on. For example, business journalists, I think, innately campaign for capitalism. I haven't read a newspaper yet where people question the basic existence of capitalism as a dominant system here. A third one is, I think, specific newspapers campaign on specific political points of view. Over the last 3-4 years, really, most British newspapers have had a position on Brexit. And the Daily Telegraph, which is one of the biggest selling broadsheet papers, is basically a campaign sheet for Brexit. Now, whether that's done them good or harm in the long run is another matter, but they do it either because this is what their editors or proprietors want, or because that's what they think their readers want. So campaigning exists in journalism, get over it, basically. This particular campaign with The Guardian, I think there are a couple of fairly big downsides to it. People who work in climate change on basically trying to affect the movement of capital from dirty to clean, not all of them approve of divestment. Some of them think it's a good way to go. It raises awareness. It may make a dent. Others say, well, look, you just sell some shares, someone else comes in and buys some shares. They're much more interested in constructive engagement with companies and basically finding ways to persuade them to move their money proactively into sort of good things. So question would be, assuming a Guardian journalist were to cover that issue, would they be perceived as being objective, given that the paper had run a campaign unequivocally in favour of divestment? Now, 5 years on, probably that wouldn't be a problem, but if they tried to do that within the year afterwards, I think it would have been a problem to try and cover that objectively. Another issue I think this raises is that by definition, the people that you affect most with a campaign that you run is your own readership. And there seemed to be an assumption, well, I'm not sure how this was probed, that actually going to the public, but actually this meant the Guardian's readership, was actually the way to get these two institutions to divest. If you're approaching that from the point of view of a campaigner, first of all, you'd actually question, you'd actually interrogate that. Do we actually need the public to do this? Is that the route? And is the Guardian the newspaper that's actually going to have the most effect? And that's quite interesting to, I mean, basically what you've got on the one hand, if you've got a paper that the Guardian that's actually in favour of divestment, basically what the Guardian is saying is you ought to do this, whatever that thing is. In the same way that Greenpeace would say, you ought to do that, or we ought to do that, or whatever. Most campaigners try to interact with media in a very different way and actually go for the one that has some sort of... So the reason why you want media, if you're a campaigner, the reason why you want sort of, newspapers to cover your stuff is not only to give it airtime, but to give it credibility as well. So, for example, when the Financial Times does a piece about stranded assets or the shareholder initiatives that are trying to get a company to look at its climate-related disclosure, that has credibility because of what the Financial Times is. Because the Financial Times has journalistic standards, they have to be informed about what their audience wants. So if you as a campaigner can get that news story into the FT, you're doing really well. And I would argue that that has more sort of impact in terms of, oh, this is an important issue and one I ought to take note of if you're an asset manager or something, than an overt campaign in The Guardian, which is the paper where they would say that anyway, wouldn't they? Because they campaign on it, but because their readership is environmentally aware. Interesting to compare it a little bit to another campaign that 350.org has been involved with, which was also to do with divestment, actually, where the idea was basically to highlight the local authority pension funds around the country. So, the hospital, the local health authority, the local council, all these pension funds that collectively across the country, millions of people have got their pensions invested in, to try and highlight how much of each of those funds was invested in fossil fuels. Now, the campaign didn't really take off in the end due to a lack of resources, but the principle was basically to personalise it, so that rather than the Guardian saying it, which is it has a slightly sort of elite readership and it's a metropolitan readership and so on, would be to actually have local papers, running things about what their council, what people who work for their council, where their pension fund would be. So you'd really try and go into this, what you might call unusual suspects, but newspapers that had a lot of salience with people who had a direct personal involvement in that. And I think you can argue that from a campaigner's point of view, that's probably a much more effective strategy, because if it works, you've then got maybe 1 million people around the country who may not be environmentally aware at all, but they are concerned about about the health of their pension fund, who would then be asking direct questions of the people who are managing their pension funds. Is my money safe? How much is it invested in an oil company? I want to do something with this. So there's just a few initial thoughts.
Okay, can I just go back to Emma, who you've got a background slightly in, largely in campaigning in some aspects. That argument that if you go with a particular type of audience, left-leaning audience, from a campaigning strategy, that's sort of delimiting your appeal and identifying you with a very narrow audience, whereas if you want a successful campaign, you want to have a broader audience. Is that something that was discussed or seen as a problem within The Guardian?
I think probably because The Guardian kind of owned the issue so much, other newspapers were less incentivized to cover it. But I think as far as I'm aware, it was only The Guardian that had already been really covering that fossil fuel divestment beforehand. But I think it led to, for example, with the FT putting Bill Gates' commitment on the front page, a sort of wider feeling of newspapers feeling they had to do something about climate change in the run-up to Paris, and they needed to be seen to be, prioritising the issue.
Okay, before I open it out to all of you, I would just like to get a sense from all of you as well about, partly drawing on your experience and views on the Guardian advocacy campaign, but also in general terms, how should one, as journalists, respond to this, very, very pressing climate emergency? Is it to go down somehow in some sense of advocacy to engage audience to take action, or should we carry on doing the same thing but find new ways of doing it? Richard, can you just kick off with a couple of thoughts on that, and then we'll go to Ingerid and...
Sure. I mean, if I was still working for the BBC, I'd be saying exactly the same thing that I'm saying now, which is that as a journalist, I think that if you kind of tell people what they ought to be doing or tell people what they're thinking, I think that has sort of that gets slightly difficult. I think if you're trying to be an objective journalist, but what you absolutely can do, and what I would be doing in article after article, is pointing out mismatches. For example, you've got governments that have signed up to make efforts to keep global warming to 1.5 Celsius. Now, if they've signed that agreement and ratified the Paris Agreement, and their own carbon reduction plan is not in line with that, then that's not it's not a campaigning thing where you're saying the government needs to do this. You're saying, look, you've said this, but that's what you're actually doing. So there's a mismatch here. It's kind of the oldest journalistic story in the book, basically, is that the government isn't doing what it says it's going to do. And you can say the same thing with companies, for example, and some of the things we've seen in the last couple of weeks about companies, paying lip service to the Paris Agreement, but then actually putting stacks of money into lobbying for, increased access to oil and gas reserves and things like this, and tax breaks. So there's enough out there. You can point to, for example, a government that, a political party that will go on about the importance of, democracy and reflecting the will of the people, and point out, well, there's an opinion survey after opinion survey showing that 70–80% of the population want faster action on climate change. So you're talking about serving your public, and then why aren't you doing this? There's enough that you can point to as sort of these mismatches and failures to delivery without, I think, having to beat people over the head.
Okay, so it's holding governments and companies to account in a more effective way.
Yeah, I think so, yeah.
The problem is that there's lots of surveys also that show that an awful lot of the public are completely fed up with climate change and don't want anything to do with it. I'm not sure that's going to, just by holding governments to power, you're going to get more engagement with the issue, are you?
I think one of the things to realise is that if in the end you want delivery, if in the end you want change, an awful lot of change happens to policies and so on, and indeed what companies do in their business, which does not involve a massive public awareness or massive public groundswell. The sort of narrow political conversation is, I would say, at least as important generally as the much wider conversation that involves the whole public. I mean, it's quite interesting. In the aftermath of the Copenhagen Climate Conference, there was a survey done across Britain. About half the population didn't even know the conference had been going on, and yet this had been, the lead story in paper after paper and broadcasters and so on, for the whole 2 weeks and in the run-up. What it shows is that there is a huge mass of people out there who do not get involved with news. So we not only operate in this narrow bubble of people who are probably, broadly liberal and care about climate change and stuff. We operate in a much bigger, but it's still a bubble, of people who are actually plugged into news. There's stacks of people out there who, and so if your theory of change is, well, we're going to get 90% of the public involved and campaigning and telling their politicians that they want to do things, evidence shows that's not going to work.
Okay, all right, we'll leave it there. Let's bring in Ingerid. Any thoughts on the proper role or appropriate role for journalists now?
I think we need several roles, and I think we need several strategies to deal with this. And I think it also depends on which media culture, which newsroom you're a part of, who your readers are. And I mean, in all of our societies, trust is falling, and a big theme on this conference is trust, and how we build trust and how we do rebuild trust in media. And there are kind of like, one strategy is adhering to the norm of objectivity. Another one is being just transparent about which values are guiding your work and which political objectives you have, and that can also be a way of building trust with your audience. And I mean, objectivity is not neutral either, right? It's if you are, I mean, the whole concept of objectivity is also preserving status quo in a way, or the dominant power relation. So it depends where you work, who you are, and what your mission is, and it's not like one right thing to do as a journalist.
Okay, great, thanks. Emma, any thoughts?
I guess I don't think that all journalists should start campaigning on climate change, because then you'd be campaigners, and that's what we have campaigners for. I think sort of in the context of this campaign, it was an experiment, and it was always going to be a short experiment into how you can try to do this differently and what you can learn from that. And I think part of the reason it invigorated people so much and got so much attention was because it broke the rules of journalism. But you can't keep breaking the rules all the time. So what I do think is really interesting and should be done a lot more is kind of not putting climate change in such a bubble all the time. So you need the environmental specialists, but if we're going to actually meet this this issue and not be faced with global catastrophe, then it requires like a wholesale restructuring of society, and that needs to apply in newsrooms. So you can't have, on one hand, an environmental journalist writing one story and then it basically being contradicted in the financial pages, or just not talked about in the financial pages, and not, how many budgets do we have where climate change is not even mentioned, or it's not even questioned about by financial journalists. So I think much more integration, and I think that's what we did do with the campaign, was that you had the finance desk writing about this issue, you had the art and culture desk thinking about this issue, you had basically every department thinking about it, and so I think internally we learnt a lot from that, and that would be great to see more of going forwards.
If I'm not wrong, I think you had something like 28 journalists across different beats and different sections of the newspaper, all working across climate change and all trying to get cross-fertilization. So the basic idea was to get this climate change out of the ghetto environmental coverage. And I think that's a very, very common theme in the commentariat, that we've got to somehow, and it's been around for some time, but finance and business correspondents have got to be just as interested in this issue as environment correspondents. It's that sort of issue. Is that right?
Yes. Okay,
so we've got about 15 minutes, and I very much welcome some comments and questions. If you make a comment that goes on for too long, I'm afraid I'll shut you up. But let's have lots of observations and difficult questions for the... anybody want to start? Yes, over there.
Hi. My name's Emily Gertz. I'm an environmental reporter from the United States. And my first question, the way you set up your polling at the beginning, I thought, didn't leave an important option. If what the science says is, as the report stated, that we have 10 years to have emissions by about 50% to avert a catastrophic change, then that's what the science says. And if you're an environmental reporter, you base your reporting on that, right? So how is that advocacy?
It's an advocate for scientific reality. I should have had that as an option, your fair point. But does anybody want to comment on that, Richard?
Yeah, that's exactly the kind of thing that I was saying. I think that's absolutely one of the bases for reporting, and always has been, actually.
Okay. Other questions, other comments? Gosh, I thought this would, yeah.
I'm Lea Korsgaard from Zetland in Denmark. I gotta say that I strongly disagree with you.
Good, some passion.
Because I think the challenge is so huge that we need mobilization on a large scale. Every every major shift in history has had roots in broad movements, I guess. At least it's a way of doing it. So the notion that we can implement a fundamental change without the broad movement is just false, I think.
Okay, Richard, do you want
I'm
to
going to completely disagree with you. If you look at one of the massive, inventions that sort of revolutionized the 20th century, television, was there a mass movement of people out there saying, I really want something that's going to bring moving pictures into my living room? No. If you take the transfer from horse-drawn transport to cars, was there a mass movement out there saying, I really hate horses, I want to get rid of them, I'd rather have something that chunters us away? No, there wasn't. If the Second World War started because, a couple of ruling dynasties disagreed with each other, I think history is just as wrong on that.
Based on a mass movement.
Well,
But actually, I would like to feed in something here. I don't know how many of you are familiar with Extinction Rebellion, which is a new grassroots sort of very activist movement in the UK. And they've based their fundamental philosophy on research by, I can't remember, the US academic, saying that you only need 3% of the population to bring about fundamental change. She's looked at, I think, well over 100 major transformations, not technology transformation, but political transformations. And she's come to the conclusion that you only need 3%. So XRs, they call themselves, Extinction Rebellion, are not looking for a mass movement of education through the media. They're targeting the 3% of the population whom they think is necessary to get climate action. And it's a really, I don't happen to agree with them because it's a doom and gloom phenomenon, and I think you need to include as many sectors of society. But it is an interesting one. You don't necessarily, from the social science work, need a huge amount of people to bring certain types of transformation. The question is, for climate change and the societal transformation, what are the interesting parallels from history that tells us that we need what type of movement aimed at what type of people? That is the question. Sorry, Emma.
I guess I'd just sort of draw a distinction there between kind of the examples with the television and with the kind of change for transport, is that those were kind of like positive changes, whereas for the kind of change that climate change is going to require, for a lot of people, the lifestyle changes that's going to mean is going to mean giving up a lot of like luxuries and stuff. And so I think there needs to be like a broad understanding among the public of why that needs to happen and the trade-offs that you face in order for politicians to be able to make any kind of argument that it's necessary to introduce these changes.
Okay, sorry, I will bring you in, but let Ingrid speak, and then I'll bring you in next, if that's okay.
Just another distinction quickly. These are also technological changes, first and foremost, and the problem of climate change and why journalism has a role is because it's a political problem and a societal problem more than a technological problem, really. Although, there's a lot of people who think we can fix it only by technology, but I don't think so. And so that's why I think journalism has a role to play in a much larger degree than from these examples.
So there are just two other... Come back quickly. Okay. Yeah. I think there are just two other points on that. One is the urgency of the transition that's required, which a colleague at the back referred to. If your sort of aim is, if your theory of change is we need to change quickly, but we need to create a mass movement, and people have been trying to create a mass movement for 25 years on climate change and it hasn't happened, you've got to question whether there's logic in that. The second thing is, even if you're right and you need to create a mass movement, how are you going to do that? Is telling people that they need to care and why they ought to care, is that the route to it? No, you've got to be far more imaginative about it and actually start where they are.
That's provoked a lot of, I can see at least 5 people who want to respond to that. So I'm going to bring in more people. Yes, if you could go next. Sorry.
Can you hear me? Yeah. So 2 things. I agree with you. It's you can say it's a negative change now. On the short term, we have to change how we live. But tomorrow, so in 10 years, as the IPCC climate change says, it's going to be worse anyway. So we're going straight on a wall. So if I slow down now, I feel that it's worse. But when I get to the wall, it will hit strong. And what I want to bring in is the new generation. So it's, for me today, not use the car, not fly, so reduce my lifestyle today, for me, is a negative change. But for people that are younger, kids today, we are stealing their future. This is what they say, the Fridays for Future. So there is an intergenerational conflict. And I think, personally, I'm a journalist, but I've been doing some activism, so talking in schools to kids, telling them what it is, what you can do about it, because I think we really need, sorry, my English, we need them to be aware of this, that with our actions today, we're stealing their future tomorrow, and it's coming in 10 years.
Great, thanks. I think there are a couple of other people. There's one there, yes, and somebody at the back, I think. Let's just get some more comments. Remember, though, that this is not about how do you get societal change. It's what's the role of journalists within societal change. It's a different question, but do far away.
Hello.
Yes.
Just have a question for Ingrid. I was wondering, since you've looked at the Keep It in the Ground campaign in the UK, do you think there's a role for a similar campaign in Norway as well? Knowing that there's been quite some divestment going on, but you're still actually a major oil exporting company.
Okay, just hold that thought, Ingrid. Is there anybody else who wants to come in on this question, 5 minutes there, of, given that we need societal change, what should be the role of journalists? Anybody else who wants to come in on that? No, okay, all right, then Ingrid, can we do the divestment campaign in other countries, I think is the question.
So I'm gonna go back to the main point of, I'm not sure that this campaign with that specific policy goal would work in Norway, just because we have a completely different media culture and what people expect from journalism. I do think we could do something like, so Zetland in Denmark, that is sitting in the front, they are now doing, they've said to their readers that journalism should not only describe climate change, it should also be part of the solution. And they're doing a lot of stories on it, and they're looking at their own CO2 emissions, and they're doing this kind of, not necessarily campaign as in we're gonna have this specific policy outcome, but we're focusing in on it, and we're showing you different solutions, and we're having a broad coverage of it. And that sort of campaign, I think, could work in Norway. There's no one doing it right now, and we need to fix that. But the specific campaign of being very political and partisan, as The Guardian was in this specific case, I'm not sure like any newspaper in Norway would do that today. Can I just quickly comment something else as well? Because what you were talking about when you were saying we should just tell people what to do, is that the role of journalism? I think that what many of us as journalists that care about climate change are struggling with is that we've been kind of thinking that we should give information to the people, and then they will that will lead to a change in attitude, which will lead to a change in action. Like we give information and people make informed decisions, and the world becomes a better place. And this, this assumption that more information necessarily leads to a change in action, it's just been proven wrong by research in many different fields, and so we need to. I don't really know what to do about that as a journalist then, if our role of just providing information, it's not enough. And so that's also what is kind of interesting with the Guardian campaign, because it gave people an opportunity to act, and it was a clear do this, we give you this opportunity to act and you can take it. And I found that exciting as a new way of thinking, and we can do more kind of those things maybe, yeah.
I guess I would just kind of add to that around the kind of giving people information that don't necessarily change their behaviour. That's true, but I guess to recognise, particularly within climate change, that 100 companies are responsible for 70% of global fossil fuel emissions. So it's not really me and you who need to change. So that's where journalism comes, the role of what Richard was talking about holding power to account, holding governments to account, holding corporations to account. That really is the most fundamental role, I think. And then providing ways for, in this particular example, for the public to get involved with holding those companies to account, rather than to focus all their attention on their own carbon footprint.
Okay, we've only got, we have one quick question, and then we'll have a final vote, and then we'll finish. Right at the back there. It's quick. Make it short because we're already running out of time.
Hi, thanks. So I'm not sure if you've mentioned it already because I arrived a little bit late, but I was just wondering what percentage of the Guardian's readership was for divestment? Or just a general idea of whether it represented really the readership's stance on whether companies should divest or not?
I don't know the answer to your question because it was 4 years ago. But I guess what I would say, we didn't ask the audience before we launched that campaign. We asked them before we launched the second part of the campaign. I guess what I would say would be that the goal of the campaign, one of the goals was to kind of mainstream divestment. And I think a lot of people, including myself really, didn't really know anything about fossil fuel divestment. I'd never even heard of it before the campaign launched. So my guess would be that most of the audience probably wouldn't have much of an opinion on it.
Okay, I'm sorry, do come up and talk to Emma afterwards, but I have been asked to wrap it up. So just to finish, responding to the observation of one of our colleagues in the audience, you've got 3 options this time to vote. The first one is, do you think journalists should be advocates for scientific reality and largely stick to reporting the science and what we know about the science? The second one is the option you can vote for. In very broad terms, journalists need to promote information that helps society reflect on how to facilitate the transformation that we desperately need to tackle climate change, or whether you think that the sort of campaign that The Guardian did is on balance a very positive thing and something that other media and organisations should consider. So first option, journalists, and particularly environment journalists, I guess, should stick to being advocates for scientific reality and stick to the science. How many people think that? They're not exclusive. Oh, God, you always have somebody clever in the audience, don't you, who says, this is just, a fun exercise. It's not subject to scrutiny. How many think the second option that I mentioned? Less than before. That's extraordinary. And how many think the Guardian campaign was a good thing and that other media organisations should do it? Hands up, I can't see you. That is certainly more than there were at the beginning. So sorry, Richard, you failed miserably.